My name is Cameron Kaufman, and I'm the president of the Buckley program. I'd like to welcome you all to our event today, Public Sector Unions, a Threat or an Asset to Our Democracy, a firing line debate between Professors Alexander Hertel-Fernandez and Daniel DiSalvo. And before I introduce our guests and our format for today's event, I do want to make a couple announcements. Firstly, for those of you who don't know, the Buckley program is an organization dedicated to increasing free speech and intellectual diversity on campus. We do so in a variety of ways, including hosting firing lines, dinner seminars, an annual conference, and lectures. And you can learn more about our program on our website, buckleyprogram.com. Secondly, this is our final event of the semester. Next semester, we should have another robust schedule. We'll have some great events like our Ideas Forum, our Disinvitation Dinner, and of course the usual firing lines, lectures, and dinner seminars. And that also means, though, this is my final event as the president of the Buckley program. I do want to say I've been honored to lead this organization. Over the past semester, I'm very proud of the work that we've done in bringing new perspectives to campus, and I'm grateful to everyone, fellows or not, who have turned out to all of our events over the past semester. It's great to see this campus engage as much as it has, and it's been meaningful for me to watch this program grow to over 300 student fellows. So I very much appreciate the chance of getting to lead this special organization. Now, on to our guests and our format for today. Both of our guests will be making an opening statement of about 5 minutes. I will then ask a question to start about a 30 to 35-minute discussion between our two guests. Then we're going to take a pause. I'm going to ask a question to frame closing statements. They'll have 3 to 5 minutes for those, and that should leave about 20 minutes for audience Q&A. On the anti-union side, on the far left for me, far right for you, we have Professor Daniel DiSalvo. Daniel DiSalvo is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and an associate professor of political science in the Colin Powell School at the City College of New York. He also happens to be the chair of the political science department there. DiSalvo writes frequently for scholarly and popular publications, including National Affairs, City Journal, Commentary, the Los Angeles Times, and the New York Daily News. Most relevantly, though, Professor DiSalvo is the author of the book Government Against Itself, Public Union Power and Its Consequences. On the pro-union side, we have Professor Alexander Hertel-Fernandez. Alexander Hertel-Fernandez is an assistant professor at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. He studies the political economy of the United States with an emphasis on the politics of organized interests, especially business and public policy. He's examined the strategies that businesses have developed to lobby across the states, the ways that wealthy individuals are intervening in politics, and their effects on the U.S. political terrain, and the politics of labor unions. And most relevantly, he's the author of the book Politics at Work: How Companies Turn Their Workers into Lobbyists. I'm looking forward to what should be a fascinating and substantive debate between two experts on the topic. And we're very proud to demonstrate that people can have civilized and reasonable intellectual disagreement on such weighty topics. So with that, please welcome our two guests, and let's get this debate going.
So while I'm getting this set up, let me just say it's a real treat to be here for a variety of reasons. First, sort of echoing the comments that you just heard, I think it's so important at this moment more than ever to have, discussions and debates between people who disagree in a civil way that can sort of arrive at more logical conclusions on both sides. I think that's a really valuable contribution of this forum. And it's also a pleasure to be debating Dan, who I've known now for several years, and I am a big fan of his work and assign it in my classes. So I fear that this may not be as much of a debate as some may hope. We may find some common ground in particular. So in my opening remarks, I really wanted to start with two vignettes that I think illustrate both the need for public sector unions when they were created in the 1960s and 70s and their continuing relevance today. So on the left, you have a picture of protests of sanitation workers who were on strike in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968. And you may remember this as the site of Martin Luther King's last speech shortly before he was assassinated. These sanitation workers, lined up and holding signs saying, "I am a man here," were calling for safer working conditions after two of their colleagues had been crushed to death by a malfunctioning sanitation truck. In addition, they were calling for higher wages and better benefits, as many of these workers were on welfare or other forms of cash assistance. They weren't making enough to make ends meet. But crucially, at the end of the day, what they were really calling for was voice, respect, and dignity on the job. Hence the signs, "I am a man, I am deserving of respect." Flash forward nearly 50 years to the day, and you've seen a series of walkouts and strikes of teachers and other educational professionals in a variety of red conservative states under full or partial Republican control. And they were protesting many of the same conditions that the sanitation workers were protesting nearly 50 years ago. They were protesting low pay and wages. In some of these states, teachers made as little as $45,000 or $46,000 on average and had to pay a significant proportion of their monthly wages in health insurance premiums and co-pays. But more generally, they were protesting low education spending. In many of these states, as I'll show in a moment, education spending had not recovered to its pre-recession levels. Fundamentally, these teachers, although they were organizing outside of the labor union framework initially, were supported by the teachers' unions and were able to use this infrastructure that had been built up since the 1960s and 70s to call on the state and local governments for better wages and better working conditions. Now, I think there's often an argument that's made by those who oppose public sector unionization that these employees are the beneficiaries of cushy wages and benefits negotiated by powerful unions over many decades. But that's simply not the case. You know, take the example of the striking teachers, for instance. The New York Times Magazine several weeks ago ran a really fascinating series of profiles of teachers across a number of states describing the second, third, and even fourth jobs that they had to take in order to make ends meet and pay for their families' needs. And this is true more generally if you look at the compensation of teachers relative to other college graduates, as indicated in the upper graph on the right-hand side. Since the 1980s, there's been a persistent difference between the wages that are paid on average to college graduates and public school teachers, most recently on the order of about $400 per week. That's true even if you control for a variety of characteristics of the workers, including their specific occupations, their gender, their race, and their ethnicities. And doing so in a regression framework where you're trying to hold everything constant, you arrive at a figure of between 16 to 27%, that these public school teachers are being paid between 16 to 20% less in wages than comparable workers. But I mentioned that teachers were not only protesting low pay and benefits, they were also protesting the broader environment in which they are working, which gets at the second reason why I think public sector unions are so essential, that they're not just calling for improved working standards for their specific members. They're trying to lobby and push governments to increase spending overall on these important institutions. And one reason why the teachers in many of these red states were pushing so hard for increased spending is, as you'll see, both on the left and the right, a number of these states have cut spending on education quite considerably relative to their levels in 2008, and the spending has not recovered to comparable levels, despite the fact that education spending is such a crucial way in which we're investing in our economy and in our local communities. Okay, so that's the broad case from me for why public sector unions are so essential. But I think another way of getting at this is simply to ask public employees themselves, do you value your union? And I think one really good way of doing that is simply to ask public sector union members today, if you had an opportunity to vote whether or not to keep your union at your job, would you do so? And that's exactly what I asked in a recent survey that I fielded of 4,000 American employees, a nationally representative sample fielded by the University of Chicago NORC Center. And in this question, 86% of state and local union members said that they would vote to recertify their union, that they said, yes, I would like our union to continue. And if you exclude members who said that they don't know, they weren't sure one way or another, and you only took people who had a strong opinion, that rises to 94%. Over 9 out of 10 of these state and local union members with a strong opinion said that they would back their union. That figure is pretty comparable for federal employees as well, 87% of federal union members, and that rises to 95% excluding workers who don't know. Why is it that these workers value their unions? Well, there's a whole variety of reasons, but one important one is that they feel that they need bargaining power on the job, as evidenced by the fact that a quarter of state and local workers and federal workers say that they need extra bargaining power in order to enforce the sort of promises that their employers make of them. Let me conclude by zooming out even further and asking, is it the case that Americans more generally support these public sector unions? And that is overwhelmingly the case. If you look at polling that was done right in the heat of the battle in Wisconsin, where Governor Scott Walker was looking to cut back public sector bargaining rights, 60% of Americans said they disagreed with what Scott Walker was trying to do. More recently, in a poll that I fielded of 1,000 American adults, a nationally representative sample, 3/4 of Americans said that they supported collective bargaining rights specifically for public school teachers. And that support for labor rights increases, is increased as well for support of striking, with 65% of Americans on the same survey approving of teachers who go on strike, like the ones that went on strike this spring to protest low teacher pay and school funding cuts. I'll end with where I think this debate is going, which is over agency fees, which are fees that non-union members pay to unions who represent them in collective bargaining agreements and grievance protections. And this was what was struck down by the Janus Supreme Court decision that I'm sure we're going to talk a lot more about in a moment. But I'll just say that 64% of Americans on that same survey supported agency fees, the measures that were struck down by the Supreme Court decision. So I'll end it there and look forward to our discussion.
Well, I too want to spend a little bit of my allocated time thanking the Buckley Institute here at Yale for putting together this event and inviting me. I'm flattered and honored to be here, and thank all of you for coming out, especially students who I gather it's the last day of class, and going to a debate about public sector unions seems low on the priority list. So those of you who are here, you really deserve a gold star. I also want to thank Alex for joining me in this discussion. I have a lot of respect for him and his work. I admire it greatly, so it's nice to have him as a sparring partner, so I appreciate him coming. I'll get right into my case as the critic or skeptic of the benefits to the broader public of allowing public employees to bargain collectively, as that has occurred over the last 40 years or so, since the late 1950s and mostly in the 60s and 70s, when collective bargaining rights were created by state and local governments across the country. So those dates in some sense tell you one important thing to consider right out of the gates, is that public sector unionism in the United States doesn't really have that long a history. That is, it's something that's been fairly new on the political scene, and certainly on the way of organizing public labor relations in the United States, which is to say most public employees for most of American history were not members of unions and did not bargain collectively. If you look at the high point of organized labor and its sort of power and influence in this country, you could say, just pick a date a little bit off the back of the napkin, of 1955 with the merger of the AFL and the CIO. About 33% of all non-agricultural workers were represented by unions at that point. But public employees in the labor movement at that time were a vanishingly small percentage. And if I had thought it, as Alex did, to bring some slides, I could have showed you the classic chart that shows you the decline then from that high point of private sector labor, and then the rise basically up until about 1980, where public employee unions start to represent about between 30 and 40%, depending on the year, of all public and state and local government workers across the country. And that number has stayed roughly stable all the way up to today. And we can talk about this more, but I'd submit it probably isn't going to change that rapidly, even in light of the Janus case, at least for the next, say, 5 to 10 years. It'll maybe be a slow grind for some of the unions. So that also tells us something else, which is that public sector unions are, in part, have a different history. They also have other features that are different than their private sector cousins, which is that they're working in an environment that's much more stable. Hence, once they unionize, they stay unionized. There isn't the kind of churn that there is in the private economy, where companies go in and out of business. They have to reinvent themselves in light of, let's say, global competition and so on. So this is really, that tells us something important, that public sector unions and private sector unions are different, which is in a way why this debate is terrific, because we're actually talking about just one piece of the labor movement. I've argued in my scholarly work that it's important to separate these two things, and political scientists and economists for a long time didn't do that basic thing. They just lumped them all together as unions, and I really think there's different properties to each. So what have been the effects of state and local governments? Because we're primarily going to be talking about them, not the federal government. While there are unions that represent federal employees, their rights are basically, the way that federal labor relations work looks a lot like Wisconsin after Scott Walker. That is, that's the starting point in federal labor relations, which is agency fees are not allowed to be charged. So unionization rates are much lower in the federal government. They can't negotiate over salaries. Salaries are set by Congress. That means directly by management with no negotiation over salary. So the number of bargaining rights in the federal government is much restricted. So we're really talking here about state and local government, but that's also should indicate another area of importance, because the vast majority of people who are public employees, myself included as a New York State public employee and public university professor, work for state and local government. That is, that the federal government workforce has held relatively flat over the last 3 decades. State and local government's grown slightly, but that's where the vast majority of people who work for government are. What's been the effect of the states that passed, we call them strong union laws, in the 60s and 70s, really beginning with Wisconsin in 1959 and ending in this wave with Illinois in 1983? I think the data show basically that it has increased the cost of government. And in part because what is the point of allowing unionization and collective bargaining? It is to require government employers to negotiate with unions over wages, benefits, and working conditions. And everyone out there wants to be paid more. There's no surprise, there's nothing bad, there's nothing wrong with that. But whether you're a teacher, a firefighter, a police officer, a corrections officer, a clerical worker, a public university professor, we'd all like to be paid more. And so that becomes one of the core demands. And not surprisingly, public employee unions were able to use the collective bargaining process and their power in politics to increase wages over, say, workers who are not comparable public workers in states where they weren't unionized. Now, we're not talking huge amounts of money here, but if you're talking about a 3% wage increase over comparable workers in another state, over time that compounds to a lot of tax dollars. So these makes states where unions are strong, notably my home state of New York, but also here Connecticut, California, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Illinois, much, much more expensive places to live. Taxes are higher, it's more costly. So it's not only more costly in salary, but people often forget that salaries, in some cases, merge into benefit costs. That is, pensions and retiree health care, especially pensions. It's calculated into the pension formula. Second, I'd say it goes to efficiency. Public employee unions have used the collective bargaining process to make government less efficient. That is, part of the collective bargaining process is over work rules. And work rules are often things that constrain management to transfer, fire, discipline, or otherwise innovate with their workforces. So you end up paying expensive salaries to prison wardens or public university presidents, but then tie their hands so that they really can't manage their workforces in ways that might rebound to the public benefit. I can give you some more examples. Third, I'd say that there's a little bit of an issue of, some people might call it corruption, or at least by the standards of our federal campaign finance, the appearance of corruption, which is public employee unions get 2 bites at the apple, unlike their private sector cousins, which is to say they get to negotiate with management, but they also get to lobby and campaign for and donate to the people that are going to be across the bargaining table from them. Right? And it's that, you could say, vicious or virtuous circle, depending on your point of view, that certainly doesn't seem exactly, at least gives the appearance of corruption. And then lastly, and I'll just conclude with saying that there's also an important infringement or potential infringement, and this has been the issue in the Janus case and elsewhere, on the free speech rights of dissenting employees. Even if on Alex's slide, 86% want the union. That's still 14% that doesn't, but they're being compelled to pay into the union whether they want to or not in the strong union states. That's a kind of compelled association, potentially compelled subsidization of speech. So if all these things, cost, efficiency, corruption, and rights, are being infringed on or infected negatively, if there were some I could see compensating factors, which is to say this increased wages for private sector workers at the low end of the labor market, if this increased political participation and civic activism, if this reduced inequality in our broader society, I might say that, okay, on balance, this is all right, but I guess I don't see anything rebounding to the public benefit from organizing things in this way, which is perhaps why 27 states have decided not to organize their public labor markets in this way. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, guys, for those opening statements. I think that one interesting place to start then is for Professor Hertel-Fernandez to talk about those compensating factors, what you think are the offsets, and maybe anything that Professor DiSalvo said that you don't think is actually a negative from public sector unions. And then on Professor DiSalvo's end, I would love for you to kind of talk about this distinction on both state sides, like the states that have stronger unions in the public sector, the states that have weaker unions in the public sector. What's actually going on the ground there, both in terms of wages and in terms of how these public agencies are functioning. How are the public schools functioning in those states? How is trash collection functioning in those states? And talking about if there is any sort of discrepancy on either side. And then we're going to have a discussion for about 25, 30 minutes now. You guys can feel free to go back and forth.
Great, that sounds good. So I just noticed an irony that I felt like I compelled to point out. Please. That it sounds like you are a rank and file union member. I'm technically management at my university now because the graduate students.
And I'm now a department chair, so I'm now enforcing the contract of management too. So
the peculiarities of public sector and private sector union law. So let me start by saying what I think the overarching benefit of unionization is, both in the public and in the private sector, independent of the differences of those sectors. And that is giving workers a voice in the management of their workplace, just as we think that democratic representation is essential to our polity. I think we could both agree that as political scientists. I think it's essential that workers, when they step on the job and are standing in front of their managers, not go from a democratic set of rules and principles to a sort of authoritarian or dictatorial one, where managers have complete control over setting the ways in which workers do their jobs and what conduct is permitted and what conduct is not. What unions do is provide a venue, a forum, a platform for workers to express their preferences when it comes to management and set rules that are put into place based on majority preferences of workers who are in that union. So that's the overarching benefit that I see. When it comes to the peculiarities of the public sector relative to the private sector, I guess I'm less inclined than you, Dan, to see fewer obstacles to bargaining. So you mentioned that unlike in the private sector, you don't have this market disciplining mechanism to check the sort of demands that unions make. Well, I would, and as a result, you've seen more stability in public sector unionization. Well, I would point to the recent developments in a number of states that are taking aggressive action to curb public sector union strength in a variety of ways as a big check on the power of public sector unions, that if public sector unions aren't able to make their case to the public or participate in politics, they will get a backlash from these politicians who can curb their rights. Similarly, I don't think it's the case that they operate without any sort of check on the sort of demands they can make, because ultimately states have to balance their budgets, and so there are competing demands from other agencies, other causes, other programs that are going to limit the sort of demands they can make in the bargaining process. When it comes to costs, I'm actually a little bit more skeptical of the evidence that you've seen direct increases in state spending that are attributable to public sector unions. The best research here comes from Agustina Pagalan, who is a political scientist at UCSD and who has done a very careful job of looking at what was happening to states before and after they passed collective bargaining laws essentially authorizing the creation of these recognized unions. And she finds that the states that ended up spending more on education or paying higher teachers' salaries were doing so and trending in that direction before the collective bargaining laws went into effect. And so I'm more skeptical that it sounds like than you are that these sort of laws are causing an increase in state spending. I think there are other changes to how state agencies operate, perhaps most notably the ways in which managers can operate, the sort of rules that are imposed on how they can manage their workers. And I think there may be shifts in the compensation package, but I don't think you see necessarily higher spending overall. Lastly, when it comes to rights, I think unions play an essential role in underpinning the sort of rights that workers have on the job. Without the representation that unions offer to, say, teachers or public sector agency workers, they are potentially at the mercy of their managers in really important ways. And so just as you can think of unions as infringing on some of the rights, they also create new rights as well. And I think it is a calculus where you have to think about the trade-offs that are implied by both the creation and absence of a union. But I would just note that no one is forced to join a union. That's long been the case, and now no public sector worker is forced to contribute to unions as a result of the Janus decision.
Yeah. I'm intimately familiar with this
Yes.
in my own workplace as a public employee. So just to pick up and offer some reflections on some of the points good points that Alex made, starting with voice. I don't think anyone should be opposed, and I'm certainly not opposed in any way to public employees or to any group of workers getting together and forming an association that wants to express their views to management, that wants to make their views heard in the political sphere. That would certainly be within their First Amendment rights of freedom of association. And I do think that there's something of value to public employees, and obviously in the private sector, managers have found in many cases that having voice come up from workers, lots of innovative ideas can come from workers. So I don't have any truck with the broad principle. It's the actualization of the principle in this highly adversarial and legalistic form that it took in public sector labor relations, which is, we have to remember that collective bargaining is a legal, in the strong union states that we're talking about, is a legal requirement that management negotiate with the union representatives and come to a contractual agreement over wages, benefits, and work rules, which means, and this is just by its nature an adversarial relationship where the demand, it takes different forms on either side, but that's ultimately going to mean that part of the voice is really about creating contracts and doing things that are going to introduce all kinds of rigidities. I guess I've experienced this day to day, especially now being department chair. When you work in an institution that is governed by a contract like this, you can see this all over the place. It consumes an immense amount of work dealing with the black letter law of any union contract, right? And also that voice doesn't always necessarily channel the total interests of all workers, or maybe even things not in their best interest. I'll give you one example from the California Correction Guards Union. It's one of my favorite examples. They negotiated they still pay prison wardens in California about $400,000 a year to manage the correction guards, but they negotiated a provision that said workers couldn't be assigned by management to specific duties inside the prisons. Rather, they would have to be, they could sign up for it on the basis of seniority. So even very older prison guards could sign up for supermax security duty, even if they probably weren't physically fit and ready for that kind of duty, but just because they wanted to get the hazard pay that would spike their pension. Right? Is that even in the interest of the worker themselves in that instance? Second, I think, voice, I think that this voice tends to be shaped in a particular and peculiar way with lots of distortions once you get into this adversarial legal relationship over contracts. Second, on the cost thing, I don't know that we want to debate in too much technical detail Augustina's paper, but this also is connected to the voice thing. In my reading, there's another paper by two distinguished political scientists, also all of them from Stanford initially, that has the strong, I think, the evidence that shows that the costs do increase by Terry Moe and Sarah Ainsia. The Augustina paper says basically unionizing public employees didn't give them any pay benefits. Who did it just help? It just helped the Democratic Party, which is that really all of this money was a way of passing through the unions to the Democratic Party. Now, perhaps all public employees are Democrats, and in fact, the evidence shows that a majority of them probably are, but nonetheless, union contributions and public union contributions go overwhelmingly to the Democratic Party. Now, if this is voice, it seems like a voice that's only speaking in one tongue, right, or only going in one direction. So I find Augustina's paper both odd in theory, since it doesn't comport with what one would expect in theory, and the practical results are unionization doesn't win any of the things Alex mentioned in his initial argument for the unions, which is higher pay. In fact, if Augustina's paper is to be believed, you don't get anything out of collective bargaining. Really, the Democrats just get more money for campaigns. So I guess I'm a little hesitant to go on board with that paper. Certainly it doesn't come out either well for voice or well for collective bargaining. And lastly, I guess this would go back to Cameron's question that he posed to me, is that we have to remember that a majority now of the states don't have these kind of procedures and processes in place. Has this resulted in a complete race to the bottom, an exploitation of public employees? No. You could take a look at Virginia, which doesn't allow collective bargaining in government at all, and has one of the most effective and best rated, as in terms of efficiency and effectiveness, public workforces in the country. So I guess I don't see a lot of evidence to show that there's going to be some quick race to the bottom where one to give up on the current arrangements.
Great. I don't want to respond to everything, but I do think that you've raised a couple important questions that I'd like to address, starting with voice, given that I think that is really at the foundation of the sort of principles that I'm putting forward. And you accurately say that the voice that's expressed by unions does not represent 100% of workers or even 100% of their members, but it offers a democratic platform through which workers can arrive at some form of recommendation or demand during bargaining processes. And the counterfactual is not having a democratic platform at all, with workers individually negotiating their contracts or how they're treated on a one-to-one basis with their managers, which is far less democratic because some workers may be able to extract more or less depending on their positions. And when it comes to our government as a whole, the federal government does not operate on a unanimity principle. We operate typically on a majority rules principle, and I think that is what governs and what makes unions work well, is that if a majority of people agree with a certain type of action, the union will move in that direction. When it comes to the effect that unions have on compensation, I think I interpret Augustina's paper as showing that they do not change the overall level of spending or compensation necessarily, or the creation of these laws, but I think you do see changes in the ways that teachers are treated on the job, the sort of demands they can make when it comes to the structure of their work, and those sorts of things are just as important as the overall level that they're paid. Furthermore, I think the structure of that compensation is affected and brings it closer in line with workers' preferences. So I think that is consistent with the sort of story that I'm putting forward here. Lastly, I would say when it comes to the adversarial nature of the relationship between unions and their employers, it doesn't have to be. You know, what I think makes unions so effective is that they can tailor their strategies, they can tailor their bargaining agreement, they can tailor their contract to the demands of their particular sector, the agency that they're dealing with. It can take on an adversarial form, but it doesn't necessarily have to. It depends on what workers' reading is of the relationship they have with their managers. So I think it offers a degree of flexibility in that regard, that unions are able to change their strategy or the terms of their bargaining depending on what the situation calls for.
I guess I'd pick up on the last point and say that might be true in theory. I guess I'd like to see more evidence for that in practice, and we can call for more research on this question. But what I guess in my observation is that, in fact, it turns out that most public contracts start to look very, very similar, which is teacher union contracts in the strong union states look pretty much the same. And those go a long way in many ways to governing how America's public schools are functioning. And this would again go to the question of whether those things were good for the teachers or good for the public, right? Teachers unions regularly claim that what's good for teachers is good for kids, that there's no gap or no daylight between their two sets of interests. I'm a bit skeptical of that claim since it's coming from a self-interested point of view, which is that there may be a gap between what's good for teachers and what's good for kids. And clearly there's been a broad bipartisan movement for school reform over the last 30 years based on data that suggests that America's public education system is not performing well. And its performance has declined under the regime of collective bargaining and unionization. And the unions have proved incredibly politically powerful at stymieing. One reads all these things about charter schools in the newspapers, but the number of charter schools and the number of students attending charter schools is very small. Vouchers have been introduced in only a couple of places. So the teachers unions have proven immensely powerful political actors in blocking any attempts to change or innovate or introduce any flexibility into our public education system. So while in theory that might be the case, I guess I don't see much evidence for that. I guess I would ask the question back to Alex on the voice issue. Is the voice exercised by public employees in the federal public employee unions in the federal government and in the rights work states, is that insufficient? They're allowed to organize. They can be heard by management. You could have even a meet and confer law. The meet and confer laws basically just require that people come and speak to management. Management doesn't have to negotiate with you to come to a conclusion on a contract. Isn't that sufficient? Or is it that we really need this adversarial relationship that's going to force us to come to some tight contractual language that's going to specify, in the case of New York City public schools, down to the minute, how much time a teacher has to interface per day with students? There's a kind of rigidity there that makes me skeptical about the effectiveness of that. So I'd ask that.
No, though I think those are certainly valid concerns to think through. On the point about choice and accountability reforms, we were just talking about that before the debate started. I think that's a nice example of how unions adapt to changing circumstances, that in a number of states you've seen unions shift their posture as they recognize that the public and politicians really want to prioritize these sorts of reforms, and they've agreed to take a seat at the table and negotiate the terms of how these particular reforms are going to move forward. There's a fantastic education scholar at Harvard, Leslie Finger, who's been looking at the politics of education reform in the states and started the project under the assumption that she was going to find that teachers' union strength was going to be negatively related with all these sorts of choice reforms. But the story that she finds is more complicated. She finds that unions, when the public shifts, when politicians shifts, they agree to take a seat at the table and participate productively in the sort of reform discussion. So I think unions do vary their strategies and their demands based on the context in which they're embedded in. And I think if you look at the teacher walkouts, I've had the opportunity to interview a number of the activists who were involved in those initial protests, especially in West Virginia. And one of the striking things that came out of those conversations was how much legwork they did, talking to community members, talking to parents, talking to church leaders, talking to respected community leaders before they made the decision to walk out. They wanted to know that the community would have their back, and the sort of demands that they ultimately put forward reflected the broader sentiment of the communities that they were in. I think that's a nice illustration of how teachers' unions in particular, but unions more generally, know that they only have as much power as is reflected in the support in the broader community for their sorts of proposals. I just want to put one more thing on the table that you mentioned in your opening remarks about how you might be on board with public sector unions if we could show concrete effects on, say, low-wage private sector workers or inequality. And there, I do think that the evidence is quite persuasive, in that, including work that I've done looking at the effect of right-to-work laws on the strength of public sector unions and outcomes for all workers, not just public sector workers. And in cases where unions, and public sector unions in particular, start losing their political strength because of changes in these labor laws that make it harder for them to raise dues and attract members, you see weaker democratic parties that are less reflective of the working class. So my co-authors and I are able to show that working class candidates are less likely to run and be elected, and state policy as a whole moves to the ideological right, and that includes things like the minimum wage. So the minimum wage is less likely to be updated and track with inflation, which affects low-wage private sector workers as well. And it also affects the broader redistributive posture of states, and states are less likely to take action to reduce inequality once these public sector unions are weaker. And I think that makes sense to the extent that public sector unions, as you've documented extensively in your own research, are so involved in state politics. It would be surprising if they didn't have an effect on these outcomes. One last example that I think illustrates this well. At the national level, the most significant redistributive measure that the federal government has created in recent years is the Affordable Care Act, and public employee unions were at the forefront of developing that legislation and pushing it through Congress. And that's perhaps the biggest action that the federal government has taken to raise the incomes of low-wage and low-income Americans and redistribute from wealthier Americans. So I think that's a nice case study of exactly the sort of inequality-reducing effects that you were calling for.
Well, on the inequality, so I guess I'd start back. I'll pick up on this point. It's a good one. I guess I would start with the classic view of what's called threat effects. This is an economist term developed initially in the private sector. And threat effects were that if one firm in a given labor market was organized by a union, the unionizing effect was to drive up wages, and surrounding firms would then, in order to stave off unionization, would also respond to the threat, and they would raise wages as well. I guess I have not seen, and I did review one paper which I haven't seen published yet. It's out there. So there are people trying to find this, but so far no one has been able to find and get through peer review a study that shows that raising public sector wages rebounds to raising wages in surrounding labor markets or private sector labor markets. So that would be the first way that one would think about public sector unions contributing to this. Now, I don't want to give Alex more material, but there is one other example, a prominent example, which he didn't mention, which is the recent push for the Fight for 15, which in part was underwritten substantially by public sector workers. So there are examples, and like the push for the Affordable Care Act, although I think that was a little bit more driven by SEIU's healthcare division and side.
Which are public sector union, public sector employees.
Well, the healthcare workers aren't.
Many of them are paid by states.
Well, they're paid by public-private hospitals, with Medicaid dollars, certainly, but it's a little bit of an indirect. They're still private sector employees. And there you can see a concrete interest in having the growth of the Medicaid program. But I guess also if you subtract a little bit from some of the other points that Alex suggests, which is really public sector unions are important, really, and this is why the issue has become so partisan, is in part because what you need is ultimately a stronger Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party really needs to be subsidized by tax dollars. Now, you can run it through this circuitous route, or what Harvard Law professor Benjamin Sachs calls just the formal matter of putting the money in the employee's paycheck and then deducting it in either dues or agency fees. And then that goes on to the Democratic Party, and only the Democratic Party will be this vehicle for reducing inequality. And maybe that's the case, but it strikes me as odd. Why bother with the unionization side? Why not just go directly to the point of subsidizing one political party if that's really what at the end of the day is doing the work? Is it really the union there, or is it the better fortunes of the Democratic Party?
Yeah. Well, this gets at a time-honored question, which is, what is the relationship between the labor movement and parties of the left? And it is true that over centuries, labor unions, and even before labor unions were formally recognized, organizations of workers have underpinned parties of the left. And so I think it would be sort of silly to not expect to see that relationship, and also silly to expect that you would get substantial redistribution absent that sort of relationship between the labor movement and parties of the left. And I think you've seen both in Western European countries as well as across the United States, where labor unions have become weaker, the Democratic Party has also gotten weaker and is less oriented towards the needs of low-wage workers. So I'm completely on board with your proposition that labor unions underpin sort of the politics of redistribution on the left. I think that's a well-documented historical phenomenon. I guess I would say I'm not as surprised as you are that we don't observe threat effects in the public sector. The only reason why you would expect to see threat effects is if there's a substantial movement of public employees between the public and the private sectors, and the employers in the private sectors are worried about losing their workforce to these public employees. But what we tend to know about public sector employees is that they tend to have a very different profile from private sector employees, and they're sort of opting into careers into the public sector. So I'm not surprised that we don't see inequality reduction effects or changes in the wage distribution as a result of that. So I guess I'll conclude with that.
I'll jump in there because it sparked a thought, which is that if we think there's some research, and we haven't talked about this as much, and this would be, again, to the question of spillover effects, positive or negative, into the public sphere of unionizing public employees. And I think there's well-documented research that private sector unions actually do many of the things that Alex suggests. And this is why I've always stressed that one could have actually quite different views of private sector versus public sector unionization, favorable to one, critical to the other. That might describe myself in some ways. Which goes to, say, political participation. And we can think about equality or inequality as also a form of political participation rather than just economic inequality. And there the evidence, I think, is pretty strong that private sector unions do a good job, strong private sector unions do a good job of bringing people into the political sphere, voting, participating, as your research shows, running for office. Now, the question is whether the public sector unions have those same effects, and most of the research that I've seen suggests that they have some of these effects, but not nearly as much. The reason goes to a point that Alex just made, which is that the demographics of public sector employees are so different, which means they employ many more white-collar workers, people already with things like college degrees, advanced degrees, who are much more likely to vote, participate, and be engaged in civic life than, let's say, the traditional image that many people have of the private sector union member. I'm thinking here of my father or grandfather, which is, everyone's image is a white ethnic in a hard hat and steel-toed boots. That was my grandfather from Sicily, worked in the steel mills and was in the steel industry. And he fit that image to a T. And certainly, he didn't speak English well. He didn't write and read well in English, but he participated in politics, certainly when that was driven in some ways by his association with the labor movement. But I guess I just don't see the public sector as doing that. Many of them, say, public school teachers, public university professors, they're going to participate and be active in the public sphere anyway.
So while it is true that when it comes to doing get-out-the-vote efforts amongst their members, I am 100% convinced by the evidence that suggests that public sector unions just have less of an oomph at trying to get their members to vote because they're already voting and participating in politics at a much higher level than private sector union members. It is true that especially at the state level, public sector unions are the most powerful political voice representing working class people more generally. And that is due to the historic structure of the private sector labor movement that tended to be strongest at the shop floor level, at individual plants or factories or stores, and at the national or international level. And there really wasn't much room at the state level for robust private sector unions. In contrast, public sector unions have to be powerful at the state level because that's the level at which they're bargaining for the most part. And as a result, they've been incredibly powerful voices in pushing for all of the sort of policies that we're describing. More generous Medicaid policies in New York State, as your research shows. Public sector employees have been an important voice calling for an expansion of the Medicaid program, which covers low-wage workers. They've been an important force pushing for higher minimum wages. They've been an important force pushing for the creation of tax credits for for low-wage households, particularly those with children. And so when it comes to state-level politics, I think if we took public sector unions away, we would see much less representation of low-wage employees and Americans, including those in the private sector. They don't have that same sort of avenue as a result of the weakness of the private sector labor movement at the state level.
You can respond to that, and then we'll wrap things up.
I'll open it up. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So for a concluding statement, and first of all, that was great. I really appreciated that. Would love to then talk about, so we've seen these are the political effects of public sector unions in terms of what policies that might be good that could come out of them. But then we also have the effects of public sector unions just on the function of day-to-day operation, whether it's the rigidity of the contracts, makes it harder for teachers, or it makes it harder for government workers to do their job, and it makes it hard for government to function. So I guess when making these concluding statements, talking about weighing those two factors, the operation of day-to-day government versus the idea that public sector unions might bring about legislation that's quite important, and in doing that, maybe also touch on the fact that, when you have these public sector unions, you have employees that then, I think that they maybe are turned against certain policies, such as charter schools, that they maybe wouldn't necessarily be turned against otherwise, because you have the union's interest in making sure that charter schools aren't strong. And maybe there's also a policy effect in that, and that people that support the Democratic Party might not support a certain policy if it's anti-public sector union, regardless of the policy. So keeping all that in mind, 3 to 5 minutes for each of you, please.
Oh, it's a lot to keep in mind.
You go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, you get to think a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm done.
So I guess I would start my closing remarks where I started my opening remarks, which is to say that the labor movement generally has provided a platform for workers to express voice. And when it comes to the sort of terms of the contract that they're negotiating with their managers, that those terms reflect the voice of the workers, the majority preferences of the workers who have organized into this union. And ultimately, I think that's the right institutional structure for the workplace. I think there's no reason that we should have access to democratic voice and a platform for expressing our voice when we're thinking about the government, when we act as citizens, and that I don't think we should lose that ability to express democratic voice when we step onto the shop floor or into a schoolroom. We should have the same possibility for expressing our opinions and acting collectively with our peers. When it comes to the sort of conflicting policy stands that unions might have, I guess I would point to the evidence that I just cited earlier from Leslie Finger and others that show just how unions adapt to changing political circumstances. And so while it might have been the case at one point in time that you saw all teachers' unions strongly against any sort of choice and accountability reforms, it remains the case that unions are pragmatic. And when they realize that these sort of reforms are on the agenda, they're going to adapt in order to ensure that they can accommodate them, and they can work with state and local governments to ensure that their teachers' needs are represented in whatever reform is put forward. And more generally, when it comes to the issue of charter schools, I think it's telling that you're seeing now a wave of unionization efforts at a number of charter schools. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, there were announcements of the first strikes or planning for strikes at charter schools, and I think it's a sign that even at these institutions that were set up in order to get around the sort of laws that are established at the state and local level for public sector unions, you saw a hunger and a demand for the workers at those institutions for a means of voice. And so that is what public sector unions provide, and that is why I am supportive of a robust public sector labor movement.
I'll pick up right from there, and I guess I would say on this question of voice, I want to introduce a final note of skepticism, which is how many of these, at least in the strong union states, where one looks and sees numbers, say California Teachers Association, 96% of all California teachers belong to the CTA. So very high union membership rates. Well, remember, the choice prior to the Janus decision of this past summer was join the CTA or pay the agency fee, which is 99% of the dues. So for many people, there wasn't much of a choice. And in fact, when we look at what union leadership and union elections, we see very, very low participation rates. Whether this union leadership is actually reflecting the preferences of their members there's some evidence to suggest that at least that as you go further and further up the chain, especially to the national level, it gets further and further away from what people care about. So like Alex's data point that he had in his slide, which is really good and really interesting, and I believe it, which is many public employees really like their local union. Why do they like their local union? Because it's focused on bread and butter things like pay. First and foremost, that's what the survey data of public employees and of private sector employees, that's the number one thing people care about. Second, probably benefits, and probably third is job protections. So they like their local union, but as this gets translated up the union hierarchy, that gets further and further away from the concerns and political concerns. So the unions take political positions that are quite far away in many instances from where their membership actually is. So I guess I would question whether this is actually truly representative in that way. And it was also, the membership was partly created out of something that was an obligation, or you were forced into it by, I can speak to a number of my colleagues I see in the hall, they say, well, I'm in the union, well, because I had to pay them anyway, right? They don't really have preferences. They don't really think much about union politics. I mean, just take union elections. The United Federation of Teachers of New York City allowed retirees to vote, and say when Randy Weingarten went up to be head of UFT, Michael Mulgrew was campaigning mostly among retirees in Florida because it was so low participation. So the union leadership often responds to a very small coterie of workers, usually more senior workers who have different concerns, and not to younger, newer workers. And the teachers' unions are famous for this. And this leads them to all kinds of policy positions on pensions and other things that have detrimental, I think, cost and efficiency effects, some of which I've already suggested. So I guess I just note that there was this element of coercion at the bottom of the way this whole system was organized that didn't necessarily rebound to the way these organizations were necessarily representing the preference, especially when it comes to politics outside of the narrow confines of collective bargaining.
Can I just say one thing that might end this on a note of agreement?
Oh, shoot, sure.
I think low turnout and low participation is a travesty, and I think that that reflects a failing of the unions in which that's happening. And I think, you know, we can all agree that more small d democracy is a good thing. And you know, we don't bemoan low turnout in midterm elections and say we should eliminate the midterm elections altogether.
No.
We say we should just increase the turnout because that avenue is the small d democratic one of expressing voice. So.
Yeah.
All right, so let's give our guests a round of applause. And does anybody have questions?
Hi, comment. Mike Canera. I'm an orthopedic surgeon, and I'm a vice president of two labor unions. 1199 of Philly, which is part of the union that represented the sanitation workers back in 68, was it? You talk about voice in the workplace, but it's also a matter of the dignity of those in the workplace. Yes, it ensures that they get an adequate wage, but that also allows them to get adequate health care and make them more dignified human beings, being able to feed their children more effectively. You say the non-unionized states don't race to the bottom. Well, in the case of the teacher salaries, it is a race to the bottom for salaries for teachers. I think that the archetypic example of the dignity that the unions try to fix is the first slide that you showed, I am a man. And that is, of course, an extreme example, but they and their fellow citizens, white citizens primarily in Memphis, considered them somewhat subhuman. So voice also means dignity, not only in the workplace. The employers are amazingly arbitrary in their managers, in the treatment of employees. And we see them all the time at board meetings. The workers who are treated arbitrarily and unfairly, and without an adjudication process at that level, they'd be fired. So I think the public sector unions do serve a role, and when they don't turn out to vote, it's probably because their job situation's reasonably comfortable. Thanks.
Thank you. How you doing? So I just have a question regarding agency fees, and so Mr. DiSalvo says that there's no choice among the public employee whether or not they want to join the union or not, because they're going to be paying agency fees anyway. But they also benefit from contract negotiations that the unions work and fight for if they're part of the union or if they're paying agency fees. So I think that's kind of like, what's that word? It starts with a C. I don't really remember. Contradiction, but it's not like that. Anyway, so like, how do you like square that whole, like, so agency fee payers can benefit from everything the union does for them, but now don't have to pay union dues or agency fees?
I'll take that one. You can add on.
Okay.
Well, just a quick word. I mean, I always wonder in these events, there's a lot of language around public labor relations and words like agency fees. Does everyone know what exactly these are and what we're talking about? I assume after Janus, everyone does. Basically, the situation pre-Janus was in any bargaining unit that was organized by a union in, let's say, the strong union states, the law, either law required or the law allowed unions to negotiate into public contracts a provision that said that anyone who does not want to become a union member, because going back to the 1963 General Motors decision, and really that was litigation that came out of the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, said that you can't be forced to be a union member, because that was the union's original position, is we want to force everyone to be members once we've organized a firm or a government employee. We can't force you to be a member, but we'll force you to pay an agency fee for acting as your agent in collective bargaining. And the agency fee, the unions in many cases set it at very close to or even 100% of what the dues was. So when people have their initial meeting in human resources, they say, well, you can sign the union card and become a union and you'll pay X amount will be deducted out of your salary on a monthly basis, or you can not sign the card and X amount will all still be deducted out. And for people who hadn't thought about this, often in some cases just signed the card because there was no choice in whether or not they could do it. Now, perhaps it's the case, now here would be the more controversial part, which is perhaps it's the case that they are benefiting from the contracts that the union negotiate. But it may also be the case that they are not benefiting. Let's say you're a hard-charging employee, you're a high-performing employee. Well, what do union contracts do? They compress, in the public sector, they compress wage scales. They make the steps and processes for promotion, I'm department chair, very rigid and very slow, right? So if you're, in many cases, this is what drives people away from public employment in the first place, is exactly these things. So maybe if you're one of those people who is really a go-getter, really works hard, you're not going to be able to be compensated. Maybe the union contract that's being negotiated isn't in your interest, and you might be better off negotiating your own contract. And I'll give you one last example, since it's a personal one and it's a matter of public record, since all New York State public employee salaries are public, so I'll talk about my own case. Our union contract allows, everyone is in a salary schedule. All the professors in City University and the State University, which is the State University system in New York. But if you get an outside offer from another university, you can be taken out of. That is, the market can intervene and you can be taken out of the salary schedule. Why did the university or the union ever agree to this position? Because it was losing lots of talented professors to other universities, because previous to one chancellor that pushed hard for this provision, you couldn't compensate good performers. I went through this process myself. I've had some of my junior colleagues who've gone through it now, and I'm thankful that we have it, that is, in effect, we can get out of the union straitjacket, and we can keep some of these terrific people in the classroom at doing their research at City College, which serves primarily low-income, minority, and immigrant students. And I'm glad they're there and not taking a job at Columbia or some other fancy university.
So I think you've put you've hit the nail on the head in describing the problem with Janus and with right to work laws as they're known in the states more generally, which is that in all of these states, at the state and local level, unions have a legal obligation to represent all of the workers at a particular work site, at a school or at a government agency, even if they're not a member. That means that if they're negotiating the contract, they have to negotiate for that member. Crucially, which is another thing that that unions have to do, which I don't think came up in your explanation, Dan, is grievance procedures. So if you are treated unfairly on the job, say you're dismissed and you feel as though you were dismissed without cause, the union is legally required to represent you with their attorneys and work you through the grievance procedure that is laid out in the contract. Those are pretty substantial benefits. Those are benefits that cost the union a lot of money to provide, and the lawyer's time and the effort that's expended in the collective bargaining procedure. And so that is the logic behind agency fees, is that if you aren't required to pay dues or similar amounts to the union, then the union's going to have less of an ability to negotiate and represent all of those workers. And that's why I think the passage of right to work laws and the passage of Janus by the Supreme Court represents such a big loss for unions. It's going to introduce this possibility for us, for those who are in unionized work sites, to get all the benefits of the union without contributing financially to them. I will say now something that is not always popular in the labor movement, which is, I think historically American unions made a big mistake in relying so heavily on dues. So the U.S. is different from many Western European countries with higher levels of union power in a number of ways. But a key way is that historically American unions rely nearly exclusively on member dues for generating their revenue. That's not true for Western European countries. They provide health insurance and pensions and unemployment insurance, and as a result they have a much more diversified set of revenue streams. And I think that has made it easier in the United States for opponents of unions to pass right to work laws, to pursue legislation at the national level and litigation like Janus in the Supreme Court that can hobble unions by attacking them through this free rider paradox. And I think unions now in the United States are sort of paying the price for not having diversified their revenue streams.
I'd add just one more point while we're clarifying and talking about the agency fee scheme. In some ways, the union also always wants this. In part, they want what's called duty of representation to represent all people equally, because they want the right of exclusive representation. And that right of exclusive representation is a powerful right, which means once a group of employees does two things. They vote to unionize, and then they vote to designate a particular union as their exclusive representative. That means that no other unions can come in and negotiate with management. Groups of employees who might have particular interests can't form their own association or union and negotiate with management, and individual workers can't negotiate. So you get a monopoly of representation. That's a powerful right. Now, the trade-off for getting a monopoly of representation was the duty of fair representation. And you can think about how some of the perversities that this leads to is everyone has seen all of the newspaper stories, which is who really comes up in a lot of these grievance procedures. It's poor performing employees. This is that negotiated into these contracts are a lot of job protections. You have a lot more job security in the public sector than in the private sector. Now, one can say whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's the facts, which is that it's very difficult, let's say, for public school teachers to be fired. That may be a good thing, but that also means you may be ending up protecting, and the union may end up spending a lot of money protecting some very low-performing teachers in some cases, and I follow the New York City schools pretty closely, teachers that have been engaged in what's considered serious malfeasance. They can't be dismissed. Right up until recently, we had what was called the absent teacher reserve in New York City, consisting of over about 120 teachers that were deemed unfit to teach in the schools for various complicated reasons, but that the city could not fire, and therefore that cost the city about $120 million a year to have these people sit in what were at one time called rubber rooms. That became, but it's basically a recreation of this system. And one can think of, lots of good that could be done in New York City with $120 million rather than paying people, in effect, not to work who've been either dismissed from their job for poor performance but can't ultimately be fired. So I guess just want to introduce a little note of skepticism on that point.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to defend rubber rooms. I think that may be too far in that direction, but I also think that the private sector is not exactly the model we want to look to either. In the United States, unlike nearly all other advanced democracies, we have at-will employment in most states where you can be hired or fired for no reason, a good reason, or even a bad reason. You can be fired for having blue eyes, for instance, in many states. There are very few legal restrictions beyond those that are spelled out at the federal level in the Civil Rights Act, say being dismissed or treated differently for your sex, your race, or your country of origin. And so I think that's also one extreme too, and that the middle ground probably would give due process rights to workers when they're dismissed or treated differently.
I mean, what could?
All right.
I think we got a couple of hands.
Sorry,
this is very anti-democratic of us to.
Yeah, one more question.
Sorry.
In the back.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Thank you again for coming. Earlier, Dr. Hertel-Fernandez, you mentioned that theoretically states and cities ultimately have to pay their bills. So putting aside whether or not when that ultimate time will come, if it ever does, we currently across the states have on the low estimate side at least around a $5 trillion debt of unfunded retirement liabilities across the states for state public pensions and other retirement health care benefits. A lot of this has exploded over the last 20 years, and over the same period of time, 20 or 30 years, the private sector has moved overwhelmingly from defined benefits plans in retirement benefits to defined contributions in plans, which by definition are always fully funded. So to what extent are public unions pressure responsible, if not for the proliferation of defined benefits plans and the, bloated defined benefits packages that exist, if not responsible for the propagation of them, to what extent are they responsible for slowing down perhaps the reforming of this system?
Yeah, I will keep my answer brief because I know this is a subject that Dan has done a great deal of research on, and so I'm sure he's chomping at the bit to
I'm thrilled you brought it up.
Yes, unfunded liabilities and pensions. Talk all day about it.
Forgot all about this point.
So here I'll say that I think it's telling that the only place where you still have defined benefit plans, so these are plans where instead of you being voluntarily directed to take a portion of your own paycheck and put it into an investment account, and at the end of the day when you turn 65, 67, 70 and retire, that's all you have for retirement. And if you saved enough, good for you, and if you didn't, or if the market crashed right before you were going to retire, you're out of luck. So that's a defined contribution plan. A defined benefit plan on the other side is a promise that your employer makes to pay a certain percentage of the wages that you have made over time, independent of however much you might be saving on your own. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the only place where you see these defined benefit pension plans are places where labor unions are strong, because it turns out that workers would rather have the sort of a security that's associated with a defined benefit plan that means that they can know exactly how much that they're going to have in retirement, much like Social Security, as opposed to a defined contribution plan where you're really at the mercy of the market in order to know exactly how much you're going to have for retirement. I don't think it's a coincidence that the expansion of defined contribution pension plans has seen the adequacy of people's retirement savings collapse over this period. You know, a large proportion, well over half of Americans, do not have sufficient savings for their retirement, and that's a real crisis, and we need to rethink it. Now, granted, I think the path that some states have taken, including the state that we're in right now, is unsustainable, and I'm not going to defend their decisions to underfund their pensions, but I do think coming up with a better system for bearing the risk of retirement security needs to be done, because clearly workers are saying we want that security and stability.
Yeah, I guess I would just add Alex's explanation of the difference. Defined benefit, defined contribution is very good. In my view, this is one of these areas where you can say there's lots of advantages to a defined benefit pension plan. It's a great deal if you can get it. But this is one of the differences between public and private sector employment, which is that compensation in the public sector is severely backloaded into retirement. Many of you have probably read stories in the newspaper about these very large double-dipping pension schemes where workers have two jobs and they're in fact making more in retirement than they were while they were working. That applies to a very small minority of workers actually, say, do the full 30 years in a single job to qualify for that plan. So I would worry about those plans both as partly something that unions now defend because that's part of the compensation structure. So they're going to go to the mat to defend those things, and because their workers are relying on them and planning on them, there's this very strong legal protections for pensions, which really reduces the policy options for reforming them, but that unions are going to defend them tooth and nail is, I think, is clear. I would also say that this also goes back to a point I made earlier about who unions are really representing, because union leadership is often very responsive to senior workers or older workers who've been on the job longer, who care more and know more about their pension payouts. They're going to be very concerned with those issues, because there's a lot, defined benefit plans are actually very inflexible, which means if you are a teacher and you worked 5, 10, 15, 12 years in one school district and move to another school district, you in effect lose out, and the money you spent in contributing to the plan is actually subsidizing the lifer. So there's a lot of inequality that's introduced. There's a lot of rigidity and incentives for people to stay put in a given job when their talents and abilities might be used elsewhere. So lots could be said about the pension systems, but politically, I think public unions are going to be their strong defenders. And now this leads me to one last point. I don't want to filibuster too much, but people often forget another huge liability where I do think the unions are more directly responsible, at least my own research shows this, which is retiree health care for public employees. And their strong union states, in my research, have much better compensated health care plans, which can be extremely costly. These often are health care plans that, let's say you're a state police officer and you retire at 55, they cover you all the way till you become Medicare eligible, and then because Medicare is not a full wraparound insurance plan, basically make it a wraparound insurance plan for the rest of your life. And these can be very large liabilities, and this goes to one of my initial points in this discussion, which was that public sector unions often drive up costs of state and local government.
All right, with that, let's thank our guests for a great debate.